Hello, welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Alana, and this is a channel in which we basically mainly review books, a few hauls every now and then, a few tags occasionally, and one thing that I'm starting to do or will be doing more frequently on this channel are these videos where I have sometimes a couple of books or maybe up to 4 books where I'm doing these mini book reviews, and that's what we have today. I have 2 books that I want to discuss very briefly because sometimes, though I favor darker, denser literature that can be analyzed for eons, I do like to sandwich in books that are lighter reads or easier reads, books that I like to read before bed that are maybe a little bit more soothing, cozier books. Maybe they're just fast-paced books that you read just for the sake of reading. And so I want to make sure that I do give those books a little bit of a shout out, but they're not long enough, or the reviews aren't deep enough to warrant one video. So in this particular review, and this will almost wrap up all of the books that I've read and reviewed in 2022, minus War and Peace. War and Peace is coming. First, we're going to start with The Diplomat's Wife by Pam Jenoff. And this is a book, I'm an annotator. I annotate almost everything I read. I did not annotate this book because it didn't require it. It was just fun. And so The Diplomat's Wife is a historical fiction novel that takes place just after World War II. The main character and narrator is named Marta, and she is a young Polish woman who was liberated from a Nazi camp by a young, handsome American soldier named Paul. And you know Paul's got to be a stud. So Paul's a stud in this book. The author wrote him that way, and I have no issues with that. And Marta and Paul quickly fall in love, and you could argue that it's a bit of an insta-love situation, which is not my favorite thing, but again, I read this for pure entertainment, and so I'm going to allow it. And so, however, Miss Jenoff doesn't let you have your way. Tragedy strikes, and Paul is killed in a plane crash, eventually. And Marta is devastated. However, she does try to move on with her life. She ends up marrying a British diplomat, and she tries to settle down in England. However, because her husband works for the British government, she actually works in the same office or department that her husband works in. And it's found out by the British government that she was part of a Nazi resistance group. And so they then employ her as a spy, send her back to Eastern Europe to assist the British government in locating a communist spy. Sounds juicy, doesn't it? It's juicy. This is a very fast-paced, very fun historical fiction novel that, like I said, you read for the sake of reading. It's you just like, I want to know what happens next. You keep flipping the page. You're not really here for it to be literarily profound. You're reading it for fun. It's one of those books that remind me of reading when I was a teenager, or even especially maybe elementary, middle school. It's summer reading. You have nothing to do. You're home alone. You're home from school. There's no classes, and you go to the library and you're just plowing through books. This is the type of reading that this book promotes. And this book is so fast-paced that after I finished the book, I was like, she packed a lot in this book, and this book is 362 pages. It moves so quickly that it actually feels cinematic. I actually think that this book would translate very well to the big screen because there's a lot that happens, and you've got a whirlwind relationship. You've got espionage. You've got plane crashes, and there's another epic plane scene. You've got fights. Like, this book should be a movie. Just putting it out there. I will say that, yes, there are parts of this book that felt a little cheesy, but in that guilty pleasure kind of way, sometimes it's just like, yeah, this has got that Hallmark vibe to it, but it's scratching an itch. And I will say, though, if I would critique this book, the dialogue needs work. It needs some reworking and needs some editing. There is something elementary about the dialogue, some of it, not all of it. Authors don't, okay, so this is one thing that I learned. We know when we were taking English classes and your teachers are teaching you how to write dialogue and what's good dialogue, what's cheesy dialogue, what's, too black and white. An author doesn't always need to have the characters speaking in almost this very robotic, basic kind of way. And so it's almost like, good morning, how are you? I'm doing great. How about you? What are you up to today? Oh, nothing. It's too mundane. Yes, there are some books where those, in certain slice of life novels, certain types of conversations will work in that way. But when you just have these characters going back and forth, giving responses that actually aren't necessary to portray in dialogue, it can feel tedious and a little bit immature for an author to do, like they're not quite seasoned yet. I will say an author that does this really well is Winston Graham in the Poldark series. He will use, many authors do this, but he's at the forefront of my mind, body language as a way for a character to respond to another character. Sometimes certain looks, movements, sometimes he'll even fade to black, or some characters it'll end on a certain piece of dialogue and then it fades to black. So you can assume by the context clues what the other character's response was. And that's more of a mature writing style. So this book uses a lot of that tedious back and forth dialogue that I felt should have been edited out in some cases. It was unnecessary and it was tedious. But overall, I enjoyed this novel. It was quick. I'm a sucker for World War II fiction. And it was cinematic, and it was a nice change from some of the other denser reads that I had going on at the time. I think I was reading this while I was reading War and Peace. And so I had this next on my bedstand, on my nightstand, and I would read it right before going to bed. And I will actually read more of her because this was just fun. I do have The Commandant's Girl, which is somewhere back here, which picks up a different storyline in this same book, but with different characters. Marta will make an appearance, but she's not the main character. So, she has, I think Pam Jenoff mainly writes World War II fiction. And depending on how I get on with The Commandant's Girl, maybe eventually I'll venture into some of her other stuff. All right, next book. This is a good one. Man, this is a good one. It's a sad one, but it's a good one. One that I also think is under the radar. I need to do another under the radar video, and this will definitely be a book that will eventually make a feature. Emmeline by Judith. No, I was right. Judith. I typoed here and called her Edith. 1 second. Okay. Judith Rossner. Emmeline. Okay. This book. What a book. This book begins in 1816. And the main character is Emmeline Mosher, who is sent from her loving, though poor home in Fayette, Maine, to work in a mill in Lowell, Massachusetts. If you are a fan of 19th century, and this is quite niche, 19th century New England fiction, yes, hop on it. As a person who has lived in New England for some time, for a period of time, it's just a jam of mine. Like this is why I purchased this book, and I ordered it from Persephone Books years ago, because I'm just a sucker for New England 19th century fiction. And so anyway, Emmeline is pretty, though she is very young. In this book, it starts off at her being 13, and she is very naive. And this young girl who is not yet 14 at the beginning of this book suffers some horrendous tragedies because no one is willing to be upfront with her about the facts of life and how manipulative and licentious some men can be. Emmeline is taken advantage of in some of the most horrific ways. Emmeline is terribly lonely by the time she gets to Lowell, and she really doesn't want to go, but her family is so poor, the bookmark's falling out, that she is sent away to help her family earn money. And her loneliness is then taken advantage of. She is put up in a house full of women, or young girls, other girls who work in mills, and The lady who runs this boarding house tells her to stay away from one man in particular. Stay away from him, but never tells her why. Everybody's cryptic. They beat around the bush. Her family never told her just how shady some people can be. And so she's just easy. She's a target. And so she's making decisions with no knowledge at all about the who, what, when, where, whys, and how. I wouldn't even say she's making decisions. She has very little agency because she is so naive, to no fault of her own. She knows nothing about the facts of life and men, and she knows nothing about sex. She's never been given to talk. Granted, this is the 1800s, early 1800s, so she's just out here winging it. And so she is taken advantage of by a man who works at the mill. This man is seemingly kind to her, and Emmeline is so desperate for companionship and relationship and to feel loved that she doesn't even know that she's being taken advantage of, and therefore doesn't even know that she's being abused. And she ends up falling in love with, what is happening? She ends up falling in love with this man because he is the only person who really shows her some type of kindness, even though he's not being kind to her at all. She has no notion of what's happening to her. Everybody has failed Emmeline. From beginning to end, this everybody fails her. And this book ends when she's in her late 30s. And she is the one who pays the highest prices. Yes, you're like, why would I want to read something like that? That sounds horrible. That sounds depressing. It sounds like Lolita. This is why I think you should read this book if you could not read Lolita. What is most striking about this novel is that this book is never graphic. She skirts around these instances that happen to Emmeline in a way that is effective, and yet it's gently and responsibly done. That's not something that I can say often about some books. She is so tactful. Rossner's tact is immaculate. If you are sensitive to certain types of content, especially dealing with children, you may be able to get away with reading this book because she's never graphic. Even though you know exactly what's happening to Emmeline, she trusts the intelligence of her reader to fill in the blanks. She doesn't need to be graphic. And the graphicness wouldn't be the point. This book, as far as how blatant it is, or it's not, it is the exact opposite of A Little Life in Lolita. Two books in which I think are absolutely brilliant. Side note, I read those books 1 to 2 years ago now, but I want to do reviews on them. And what's even more wild, this book was actually based off the true life of a woman in Fayette, Massachusetts, who lived hold on, it's right, there's a note at the beginning of the book on one of the pages. The story of Emmeline Mosher, who was 13 when the book begins, was based... Sorry, I have an error here. So I say the novel begins in 1816. It doesn't. It begins in 1839. But Mosher, the main character in the story that this story is based off of, were born in 1816. So the story of Emmeline Mosher, who was 13 when this book begins in 1839, was based on that of Emmeline Gurney, who lived from 1860 until 1899. So there is just something quietly profound about this book. This book will stick with me for a long time. It is simply written. It's very poignant. Yes, this is a sad book, but there is, again, something striking about it. And what I think is most striking about it is not the content, it's how the content is handled. It is just as gracefully done as I think that you can write about this type of thing. It's very difficult to describe. And I also felt this rage just about how much she was failed and blamed for things that were really outside of her control. And yet, Emmeline, as sad as her life is, makes a decision to keep living. This is a phenomenal novel. I rated it a 4 out of 5. I don't know if I said it earlier. I rated The Diplomats Wife a 3 out of 5. I rated this a 4 out of 5. This is one of those seemingly quiet novels because when I first read it, I was like, oh, this is going to be a quiet, gentle novel. False. it's quiet, but it's not the content. It's a sad book. It is a unsuspecting storm in a teapot cup. I highly recommend this book. It is a Persephone book. If you do not live in the UK, getting Persephone shipped to your country, especially post 2020, it is expensive. If you can find this book on Amazon or eBay or maybe A Books, something, if you can get your hands on this book, get your hands on it. Even if you can find the non-Persephone version of it, man, a very noteworthy book. I read it in December. I'm going to keep thinking about that book. It definitely will be reread at some point. If you liked Lolita, isn't it weird to say so you liked Lolita? If you appreciated Lolita, it would be a good book, I think, to actually pair with Lolita. Because you have some interesting scenarios in which you have these men taking advantage of these young girls, but they're handled in two different ways. And also the points of view are completely different, because in Lolita, you get the perspective of the abuser. And in this book, it's written in third person, but it's not third person omniscient. You're really focusing on Emmeline and what she's going through. Anyway, that is all for these two very quick book reviews. Have you read either of these books? Are you now interested in any of these books? Does any of them pique your interest? Please let me know in the comments below. Feel free to like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram, where I'm always on and getting up to more bookish shenanigans. I will see you in the next one.